Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by NCSL. It's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Lucia Bragg. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar entitled Multilateral Mitigation, State-Federal Collaboration to Build Disaster Resiliency. Today, we will discuss approaches states are currently implementing around disaster mitigation, as well as recent actions the federal government has taken around their collaboration in disaster mitigation. My name is Lucia Bragg. I'm a policy associate for NCSL's Law, Criminal Justice, and Public Safety Committee, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before I introduce today's speakers, however, I want to review a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is part of the Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee's 2018 Spring Webinar Series. As part of the series, the NRI Committee will host a new webinar every other week, with its final webinar day, June 28th, which will examine federal infrastructure funding boosts and the outlook for a comprehensive federal package. For complete previous webinars from our 2018 series and registration details, please visit our website at www.ncsl.org. So this webinar is hosted in tandem with NCSL's Law, Criminal Justice, and Public Safety Committee. If you do have any questions about the committee, please contact myself or Committee Director Susan Frederick. As a reminder, our webinar today is being recorded, and registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar and presentation slides on NCSL's website. We will send out a notice shortly with a link to these resources, and additionally, you can download the slides being used today on the yellow and blue library icon in the upper right-hand portion of your screen. I know listeners will have a lot of great questions for our presenters, so we will hold Q&A until the end. The Q&A will be held through our chat box on the lower left-hand side of your screen. So please feel free to type your questions in there at any time during the presentations. And as your moderator, I will be gathering the questions and we'll read them out to our presenters towards the end. But back to why we're here today. So in the wake of 2017's record-setting natural disasters, various components of the state and federal government have been mobilizing to work collaboratively to better prepare and protect natural and built infrastructure to reduce the human and economic impact of other events. Today, we will explore examples of approaches states are currently implementing around disaster mitigation, as well as recent actions the federal government has taken to help lessen disaster impacts and improve collaboration. Today, we are so lucky to have three great speakers with us. We have Representative Holly Rothschein from the Florida Legislature, Mike Grimm, who is the Assistant Administrator for Mitigation at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and Matt Cowls, who is Deputy Director of the National Emergency Management Association, or NEMA. First up today, we're going to hear from Representative Holly Rothschein, is a member of the Florida House of Representatives, elected in 2012 in 20th District, which includes Monroe County and southern Miami-Dade County. Originally from Alaska, Holly's attended Florida State University, where she graduated with a degree in political science in 2003. And she then moved to the Keys, where she worked as a district aide and then legislative aide for Representatives Sorensen and Saunders. Holly serves on 6 committees in the Florida House, including chairing the Natural Resources and Public Land Subcommittee. In 2017, Representative Rothschein received her master's in public administration from Florida International University. She is also active in numerous organizations, including the Florida Defense Support Task Force and Florida Council on Arts and Culture, as well as the National Foundation of Women Legislators. Representative Rothschein, the floor is now yours.
Wow. Well, thank you, Lucia, and shout out to NCSL for hosting this very important webinar, and what I would say a very timely webinar, having just kicked off hurricane season June 1st. So again, thank you so much for the for the opportunity to present today. And what I thought I would do is just kind of maybe paint a picture for what our community down here in the fabulous Florida Keys went through with with Hurricane Irma, and just kind of different silos, like when the storm actually passed and the aftermath of it, recovery, ongoing challenges that we're still facing, like many other communities around our nation, and of course, island of Puerto Rico, and then talk a little bit about the legislative and governmental response. So, so Hurricane Irma, as everybody knows, made landfall in the Middle Keys on September 10th. Just for those folks out there who don't really maybe have been to the Florida Keys, and we'll have to have you down, we're about approximately 120 miles long. We're an archipelago. We have approximately 77,000 residents, and we're environmentally sensitive. Tourism is our top industry, and we're kind of the tail end of the Everglades system. So with that, after landfall, we took stock of our housing, and in the areas that were hardest hit, again, the Middle Keys, the city of Meredith Key, we lost more than 1,000 units of housing right off the bat. In the wake of the storm, we were able to remove about 1,000 derelict vessels that were stuck in our water surrounding the Keys. More than 2.5 million cubic yards of land base had to be removed from our roads and our neighborhoods. One thing that around in the days after the storm that was abundantly clear from surveying the damage Hurricane Irma in the Keys was the effectiveness of the Florida Building Code, and strengthening of the code has really paid off. Code and code compliant structures did way better than the older housing stock, especially those homes from the 70s and 80s. But again, the new code came in the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew. With that said, recovery and the recovery wheelhouse, at the very beginning, the just essentials were very key. Food, fuel, water, and communications. We had a time where not even satellite phones worked. Nobody could use their cell phones. Obviously, landlines were down, and it was incredibly hard to disseminate information. If you were in Monroe County, in Nicholas, if you were just outside of it, or if people had evacuated, you couldn't get information down. Emergency personnel needed food, water, and fuel, and communications. We had a tremendous amount of resources that had to be brought in by car, and we have one highway, US 1. We had to make sure, first off, before we even opened up the community to Reentry, we had to make sure that our 42 bridges that connect our islands and importantly carry our water down to the Keys were sound. After that, we obviously focused on the need to restore power. We were dealing with, again, massive amounts of land debris. And our unique geography, again, we're 120 miles long. We had land debris, we had marine debris. I'd already mentioned the boats and so on and so forth. But we also have a very intricate and complex canal system up and down the Keys. So that was an incredible challenge. I can talk about that more later. In terms of reentry, we are one of the only counties, probably in the southeast or certainly in the state of Florida, that can cut ourselves off. We can close down two separate entrances to the Keys. There's Cardstown Road, that's a county road, and then, of course, US 1. So we did close that down. And our evacuation, I must say, kudos to our residents. We had about a 75% evacuation rate, and it was obviously a mandatory evacuation. And a lot of people heeded that warning and left. And I think we had a very, very minimal loss of life. And I think that probably the numbers would have been larger had folks not left, certainly in the areas where the eye moved through. But again, reentry was a bit of an issue. Initially we only had essential personnel that were allowed in, obviously first responders, healthcare workers, folks that were bringing resources, construction companies that were assisting us with removing debris, and so on and so forth. And then a couple days later, we were able to open up the upper Keys, and that was Key Largo and Isla Morada slowly. And, really just for residents to come in and kind of assess their situation. Again, most people didn't have power by then. We didn't have water. We didn't have sewer services. So we really, really tried to control the amount of people that were returning because, again, we didn't have all those essential services turned back on. We've had since, and I can probably talk about this in the after, or, you know, the lessons learned, I guess, from Irma, but it was a big struggle for the emergency management and the county officials and folks on that team to let residents return. If we waited too long, you know, this memory might go on and evacuate next time because, you know, it's not if, it's when the next time comes. And again, we had to get essential services up. We had to open up the hospitals and things like that. And, you know, just the cumulative effect of the 2017 season, and I know that's what we're focusing on. And we had so many devastating hurricanes that it made, I think, the recovery efforts a lot more difficult. We have obviously Texas recovering from Hurricane Harvey, then obviously Florida with Hurricane Irma, and then Maria devastated Puerto Rico shortly thereafter. But, you know, and all of those storms still had impacts far outside that directly hit, or I should say, I can say with a lot of confidence that overall I think that Monroe County's response was incredible. We didn't have a sound EOC. We actually had to evacuate our first responders and our emergency management team further north away from the storm. That's since a project that I've been working on for funding to get an actual viable Cat 5 rated EOC. So that is moving forward, but I'm very happy to report. Again, I'd mentioned earlier, tourism is one of our it is the leading industry here in Florida and, of course, in the Keys. And we were very, very lucky that the upper and the very, very lower portions of the Keys, that means Key Largo at the north end and Key West, obviously, at the bottom, were not as severely impacted as other parts of the Keys. And we were able to open those areas up a little sooner and get tourists back in a quicker fashion. Other areas, including Alamorada and the city of Marathon, they sustained more extensive damage, and they've been since opening up their hotels and their businesses in a more piecemeal basis. Our occupancy rates and average nightly rates are still a little bit low. We're usually a leader in that front for our state. The tourism numbers in Florida as a whole are still very strong. I think we're still on point to have a record year, which is amazing considering Hurricane Irma. We do have a greater capacity for tourism, which means our fishing guides, our hospitality employees, and all of those folks in those arenas are getting back to work as well. So I am really excited to report that. On some issues, programs that worked, we had volunteer groups from all around the nation and really around the state that came in, and they didn't require a lot of oversight or resources to get the ball rolling or to get out there and get into community and provide the services that they were bringing down. The Mormon Church Bowl just brought an army of people who brought their own tent, their own water, their own food, camped out, and were able to go house by house on a house-by-house basis, just reaching out to residents saying, hey, can we cut those trees? Can we clear your driveway? Can we help pull whatever out of the water? So just a big thank you to the volunteer groups that came down. The STEP program, and this was through the Florida National Guard, and what that was the STEP program. Basically, we would have a team of national women come in to demuck, and that's an actual we use to demuck homes and repair them just enough so that families could actually get back in their homes and reoccupy their homes while the rest of the repairs were completed. And so we would, the National Guardsmen and women would provide the kitchen area, would fix up the kitchen area, one bedroom and a bathroom, basically just the essential rooms for folks to be able to live in their homes. And then again, we have an amazing nonprofit system or community here in the Keys, and they all really stepped up to kind of provide the mechanism or the machine to get all of those resources that were coming down the pipe out to the people. And we've had numerous financial donations and things like that, and having that backbone of the nonprofit world was extremely helpful. And the silo of ongoing challenges, which I'm sure we're not alone as a community in this front, but housing. The number one issue that's facing our long-term recovery in the Keys, an affordable/workforce housing problem before the storm, and we certainly now have a crisis on our hands. But we are an area of critical state concern. I don't want to go into the details on that, but with that designation comes a large amount of other boxes that have to be checked, and a lot of other just we have oversight by the state. Our permits are limited and things like that. But the legislature, obviously, my colleagues recognized the dire situation that we were in, and I was able to secure about $15 million to incentivize the development and building of affordable housing. The Florida Disaster Recovery Initiative, which is actually being reviewed right now at the federal level, includes a significant amount of funding for development and affordable housing in the Keys. Very, very excited about that. And we also have a local land trust that has developed on its own in reaction to the need that is rebuilding affordable housing units in Big Pine, which suffered probably the greatest amount of damage and the greatest loss of homes. FEMA Reno, we have a gentleman here from FEMA, which I'm very excited to hear from him. And I really value our state emergency management team for staying in close communication with us during what we could easily call an extremely cumbersome and bureaucratic process, but we are definitely still struggling with the slow pace of reimbursements. And again, I know we're not alone in this, on that front. Several of our local governments and utilities have actually had to take out lines of credit to kind of replenish their general funds until the reimbursements come through. And our local governments are justifiably concerned as we are now presently in a current hurricane season. In terms of bridging the gap, at least following a disaster, there's always an abundance of resources. For us, it was almost more than our little island chain could handle. We really relied on volunteers and agencies on the ground to kind of, really keep this. But now we've come into what I would call the difficult period of recovery. We're waiting on, obviously, the federal recovery funds, reimbursements, and things like that. And obviously, you can't just throw up a home. We still have folks living in tents and campers and things like that. But again, I know we are not alone. There's other challenges that we face. Is extremely high. We've lost not all the population, but we have lost a lot of the workforce just because there is no place to put them. Small businesses and big businesses alike are kind of struggling from that. But I see resources are intended to come our way. We're going to see a lot of success and a lot of improvement. In response, moving on to the legislative and government side of things, in response to storms making landfall in Florida in the last couple of years, the Florida House, under the guidance of our Speaker, Richard Corcoran, established the Select Committee on, and I actually had the opportunity to sit on that. It was made up of 21 members, including representatives from all across the state that were hit by these storm seasons. We received a ton of information and updates from all stakeholders, from healthcare to education to the fuel industry, to obviously the land trust, you name it, we heard from it. And we were able to put together a long laundry list of recommendations on how we could move our state forward in terms of public policy. And we were able to implement some of those suggestions. And again, I know I have a limited amount of time, so I don't want to go into the details, but they ranged from, again, changing our land acquisition programs to kind of be able to mitigate for flood issues. We also included, obviously, I talked about housing, and there's some provisions locally here that will be helpful to our taxpayers that, folks' homes substantially damaged or just completely destroyed. They've been paying property taxes on these properties that come 2019, they're going to be able to apply through our property appraiser's office for refund. And so, Lucia, that's just kind of a real top-level story of the Keys, where we're at, and where we're going.
Great. That's fantastic. Thank you, Representative.
Sure.
As a reminder, all participants, questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. So please type them in the chat box as we go to the left of your screen if you have any, and we will revisit those at the end. So next up, we have Grimm. Mr. Grimm serves as Assistant Administrator for Mitigation. Mr. Grimm directs FEMA's pre- and post-disaster mitigation programs that support sustainable, disaster-resilient communities to avoid or reduce the loss of life, property, and financial impact of natural hazards. These programs include the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grants, the Floodplain Management component of the National Flood Insurance Program, and the Community Rating System under also the NSIP. In addition, Mike leads the Hazard Mitigation Disaster Workforce Cadre and overall disaster operations for FEMA. Mr. Grimm was appointed to the Senior Executive Service in 2011. And throughout his nearly 20-year career at FEMA, Mr. Grimm has worked to improve coordination, collaboration, and transparency across various levels of government to align the larger national mitigation policy agenda for reducing nationally, creating more disaster-resilient communities.
Thank you, Lucia. This is Mike. I appreciate the intro. I'm so glad to be here, and Representative, thank you very much for highlighting the so many challenges that you faced in Florida. You know, in 2017-18, we've hit some major milestones across the country, and of course the disaster season we had across the country was historic. I just want to highlight a few figures from that, but what I do want to talk about is kind of where we've been in mitigation and where we want to head as a nation, and some of the national imperatives that our administrator has laid out in our strategic plan and how to get there, and look to everyone on the call here for ideas and input on that. So just for a second about the disasters and a few facts and figures, you know, with the Harvey, Irma, Maria, the California wildfires, and many other smaller disasters, but 25 million are impacted, and you know, we touched every one of them in some way in terms of the FEMA, the state, the local response and recovery. Within the federal government, we deployed over nearly 20,000 folks from FEMA and DHS, and it's pretty amazing because if you think about the average city in the United States, it's about 21,000 people. Historic year for processing about $10 billion worth of claims, and across FEMA inspecting 2.3 million homes. And then with individual assistance program that touches individuals and homeowners in the immediate aftermath, we had over 5 million registrations, and what's amazing about that is it's more people than we registered in Katrina, Sandy, Irma, and Rita combined. So phenomenal amount of effort across all levels of government and the private sector. Now we have dollars in mitigation dollars available across the impacted states, and that's a huge opportunity. I want to talk a little more about that on how we might leverage that in different ways. A couple other things that I wanted to touch on too were some anniversaries of the 50th anniversary grant program. And when we look back over the 30 years, how we've evolved and where we're going to go in the future, you know, our first acquisition was in Utah, our first safe room in Iowa, and our first tribal project in California. And back in the late 80s there, early 90s, the grant budget for FEMA was about $200,000. And that was mainly for public education and outreach to individuals after disasters, not necessarily the projects that we take on now. Since then, our mitigation assistance program have really grown and changed in many ways. And not only do we have the hazard mitigation grant program that comes in after the disaster, but we also have the flood mitigation assistance that focuses on the National Flood Insurance Program insured properties, and particularly repetitive loss properties. And then we also have pre-disaster mitigation grants. And big year for pre-disaster mitigation grants with an appropriation of $249 million, so it's very exciting. These three sets of programs over the last 30 years, we've gone from that $200,000 budget to now over providing $15 billion to help communities and states and tribes reduce losses and protect life. What does that mean? We've acquired 55,000 properties in acquisitions that remain in open space in perpetuity. We've done over 37,000 safe rooms for tornado in community spaces such as schools and community buildings, private residences, and we've elevated over 10,000 properties in or out of the floodplain, and many other projects under this programs as well. Within the NFIP, so we have the grant side and also the NFIP, the flood insurance program, and managing floodplains, and we have almost 23,000 communities now enrolled in the NFIP, where these communities are choosing to protect themselves by managing floodplains. And as the representative mentioned, building codes are a huge piece of that. The reason many buildings perform so well in Florida and other places are because of that adoption and enforcement of codes and standards. So while most FEMA programs arrive after a disaster is declared, the NFIP, we're there every day in those 23,000 communities, lowering the built environment's exposure to flood, and to save about $1.9 billion a year in losses avoided. We've also got, out of those 23,000 communities, 1,500 other communities that have joined what we call a community rating system, and that's communities who are implementing higher standards, higher than the minimum flood standards. Sounds like a small number, but why it's so important and why those communities are able to recover faster than other communities, so that an insured survivor is going to be on the road to recovery faster than an uninsured survivor. And we also provide $350 million in premium reductions because those communities are taking proactive action. So I threw out a whole bunch of numbers with the recent disasters. 3 lessons that we learned from last year's disasters. And you know, I've been around FEMA for a couple decades now, and I feel we as a nation keep seeming to experience these lessons, and we will learn from them finally. But one, people and communities need to understand their risk better than they do right now. For example, insurance penetration is not where we need it. There's not enough folks insured in the nation to get on that road to recovery. As a nation, we also need to do more to mitigate our risk. And I will talk about that in a second as well. I forgot I was clicking my slide, so there's my floodplain management slide. So while we do a lot of post-disaster work and we build back stronger, and that's an imperative, as a nation we've got to do more before the disaster, because we know doing it after a disaster is too late. You know, we know that our mitigation grants delivered pre-disaster increase resilience in communities and neighborhoods, and a recent study came out from National Institute for Building Science that demonstrates the return on $1 invested in mitigation is a return on of $6. So for anybody who hasn't seen that study, I encourage you to see it. But our post-disaster spending is so much higher than pre-disaster. Since 2003 as a nation, we spent over $10.3 billion for post-disaster funding versus a mere $1.8 billion in pre-disaster funding. As you can see, my slide is trying to illustrate those pre-disaster investments, whether it's in the NFIP and the community rating system, or the grants, pre-disaster mitigation and flood mitigation. The dollars spent pre-disaster just you know, are eclipsed, crushed by the post-disaster spending that we do. So our administrator laid out some very bold priorities in FEMA strategic plan. Strategic goals, building a culture of preparedness, readying the nation for catastrophic disasters, and reducing the complexity of FEMA. So for the directorate that I lead, what does that mean? And we laid out a couple of moonshots, thinking back to Kennedy era moonshots. Our two moonshots are to double the number of flood policies by 2023 and quadruple the amount of pre-disaster mitigation spending by 2023. And those are reflected in the strategic plan as a strategic objective, with incentivizing investments that reduce risk through the pre-disaster and closing that insurance gap. And so what does that mean for me and the mitigation directorate and my team and leading? It means we've got to find ways to build more resilient communities by larger investments in floodplain management, the code adoption, and mitigation before the disaster strikes. And find ways to encourage private sector partners to invest in buying down risk and building resilience. Reducing those administrative bureaucratic burdens that keep individuals and communities from receiving assistance faster. I think the representative mentioned some challenges in funding streams and that sort of thing. So we are very serious about finding innovative and responsible ways to simplify our programs and policies. So more specifically, what are we doing? We're looking at how we maximize effectiveness in the post-disaster, and a lot of that is around that rebuilding. Representative also, I believe, mentioned the substantial damage and looking at how we rebuild to higher codes and standards and compliance, and how we work to make insurance, frankly, more affordable through rebuilding in a compliant manner post-disaster. And FEMA will be there and is there in those communities that, well, frankly, have the most risk or perhaps have the opportunity to influence future development and where might it not go, by providing access to technical assistance and training and certain things. In an example, in Hurricane Harvey in Texas, we've been working on some data-driven methodologies for streamlining and expediting the rebuilding efforts in that substantial damage space. So using big data to help triage and focus where we're going and providing that to the community to assist, because many of these smaller communities are quite frankly overwhelmed. As I said, we have about $5 billion now for HMGP in the impacted states by Harvey, Irma, and Maria, and it's a tremendous resource that will be available, and we need to use those mitigation investments to catalyze others to invest as well, and not just across the government and state and local, but with the private sector. So let me shift to pre-disaster, because as I said, we really can't just wait for a disaster hit to mitigate. We've got to look for more ways to do more pre-disaster mitigation. So some of you may have heard about the Disaster Recovery Reform Act legislation that is out there right now. It's FAA in the FAA authorization bill, and that would increase federal investment and focus on pre-disaster mitigation grants. The way the pending legislation is written right now is a percentage of the previous year's disaster spending would be made available for pre-disaster mitigation. And if it passes, we could be talking about billions of dollars available for the pre-disaster. As I said, this year we're excited because we got our biggest appropriation ever in the history of the program at $249 billion. This pending legislation could literally make billions available pre-disaster. But our moonshot and our strategic plan is not simply about quadrupling the nation's investment in mitigation by increasing FEMA's grant dollars. Now, we have to be ready to do that if it happens, but it's about catalyzing and incentivizing mitigation from new partners in new ways. How do we engage the private sector in both mitigation and insurance? So to wrap up, we know that smart land use decisions and purchasing insurance and increased mitigation investments in the pre-disaster are the wisest actions we can collectively take. And, you know, we'll never be able to eliminate risk, but we can mitigate it. And we got to do this by through a system that's federally supported, state managed, and locally executed. So, you know, I'm excited, you know, over coming weeks and year and whatnot to explore ways with you all and other groups, you know, to find new ways to leverage current mitigation investments, to increase investments by non-federal entities, and to create new relationship and partnerships. And you know, hopefully we'll have time for some questions or comments at the end, and I welcome any advice from you all how we can best do that. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. Last but certainly not least, we will hear from Matt Cowls. Matt is the Deputy Director of NEMA, the National Emergency Management Association, where in addition to assisting the Executive Director with managing the association, he has the responsibility for the association's Washington, D.C. office. He previously served as NEMA's Director of Government Relations from 2009 to 2015 as well. And during his absence from NEMA, he went to the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Homeland Security. While with the committee, Matt was responsible for $23 billion in federal funding to FEMA, the Coast Guard, the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office, and the Office of Health Affairs. Matt began his career working for various members of the Michigan State Legislature before coming to D.C. in 2001 to support state and local preparedness programs in the Department of Justice, and later the Department of Homeland Security. He also works with the Center for Homeland Defense and Security as part of a team of subject matter experts conducting executive-level seminars with governors and mayors of major metropolitan areas. So, Matt, the floor is now yours.
Thanks so much, Lucia. I really appreciate it, and thanks to Susan also and all of NCSL for putting together this great webinar. I think so far the representative and Mike have highlighted the state and federal sides of the overarching mitigation issues, and hopefully some of my comments here can tie things together. NEMA represents the 56 state emergency management directors of the 56 states and territories of the United States. We have a very broad range of membership, including, in addition to the state directors, we also have state staff, private sector members, and even students that can join NEMA. Our major priorities, you can see here on the slide. I won't read them to you, but we mainly do these through state-to-state collaboration, working closely with FEMA, DHS, and Capitol Hill. We do webinars similar to what NCSL does. We conduct 2 annual conferences, and we're also the administrators of the Emergency Management Assistance Compacts, which helps facilitate state-to-state mutual aid assistance in the time of a disaster. And we also do working groups like the National Homeland Security Consortium and a working group on public health between AASHTO and state territorial health officials and the governor's Homeland Security advisors. So today I'm going to briefly cover some of our priorities in mitigation, some of what's going on up on Capitol Hill right now. Mike gave me a perfect segue on that, so I appreciate that. And then some very specific state examples of what's being done to try and incorporate mitigation at the state level. So here you can see what I've laid out for some of the priorities in mitigation for NEMA, and I think it's important to note that these aren't necessarily siloed, but they're complementary of one another. We do all of these things throughout the year. Things like our mitigation committee. We have several policy committees. Mitigation is one of them, and it handles only mitigation. So it addresses and promotes many of these issues throughout the year at our annual conferences and even in between. We partner very closely with other associations like NCSL and our counterparts that handle local emergency managers, state floodplain managers. And we work with them to promote programs like PDM that was already mentioned, the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program, and smart usages of the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And similar to what Mike mentioned, CRS, Community Rating System, is very important in helping drive down some of those costs. We often talk about enhanced mitigation plans that are approved by FEMA. There are a lot of benefits to that, and provide discounts and cost share, et cetera. And it is important to note, Mike did mention it, but it's important to note the recent change in the return on investment from mitigation from $4 to $1 to 4 to 6 to 1. So it's a very big talking point for us in terms of being able to promote mitigation. When we talk about utilizing available and emerging technologies, this can range from some of the LiDAR technology out there right now to do flood mapping, what I'll talk about in more detail in just a second, but also things like ensuring that current infrastructure is strong enough to be able to handle a storm, and smart land use. We really saw this play out in Houston, where a lot of the mitigation efforts that had taken place down there over time actually were part of the problem in terms of directing water to where we didn't want it to go. And I don't think it can be understated the importance of encouraging flood insurance. There is a great need across this country to be able to talk honestly about what it means to have flood insurance, what FEMA programs are available in the wake of a disaster. Mike probably has better numbers on this than me, but from what I've heard recently, the average payout for Harvey out of the individual assistance program was about $5,000, whereas the average NFIP payout was about $110,000. So it's quite a difference when you can be adequately insured. Mike mentioned the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. This is probably the biggest effort affecting FEMA and the nation's emergency management directors going on in Congress right now. It's gone through several different iterations. It was originally introduced in the House back in November. There have been several attempts to try to move this package, but it has passed the full House twice now. Three of the provisions were picked up during the last disaster supplemental that were done, and as Mike mentions, currently on H.R. 4, which is the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018. I realize that doesn't make a lot of sense, putting a disaster bill on a reauthorization act, but currently in Congress, with the way things are moving, always looking for any opportunity to be able to hitch a ride on something that is moving forward. So I laid out some of the key provisions here that we are keeping an eye on. We'll be doing a fairly large assessment of all the provisions in both the House and the Senate version. As I mentioned, it's already passed the House. The Senate marked it up yesterday, and so they'll start conference negotiations here over the summer, and we'll be working closely with the staffs as they work to reconcile the two versions. They're fairly similar, with only a few small changes between the two. The wildfire prevention is a provision that was done once before in 2015, and it's a good policy to be able to allow FEMA to award hazard mitigation funds on wildfires. State Administration of Housing, this really ties to a current effort also within FEMA to encourage more state-run disasters. And in order to have more state-managed disasters, management costs are really key. The BRA specifically raises the management costs, but NEMA and IAM are also working closely with FEMA right now to try and encourage them to give the flexibility to allow disaster management costs to roll over from disaster to disaster as well, which would be incredibly helpful in being able to build capacity at the state and local level. Section 635 listed there, this is what Mike went into some detail about with the 6% for mitigation, so I won't get too deep into that one. And a couple of problem areas that we've highlighted for staff at this point. Section 609 pays for Army Corps projects out of the Disaster Relief Fund, which is really intended for state and local response and recovery. And we're also working with ASFPM to assist the movement of inspectors through EMAC through Section 637 there. So as I mentioned, there were a couple of provisions that got picked up from a previous version in the Disaster Supplemental that was done back in February. I apologize for the duplication of benefits bullet there. That should not be on there. But Section 2604 of the Supplemental gave eligibility to specific private nonprofits that changed the eligibility structure for public assistance, specifically houses of worship, and then Section 2605 allows FEMA to adjust the cost share through mitigation incentives, including building codes. Both of those came out of earlier versions of the DRA and were picked up at that time. In terms of the appropriations process, these two really do tie together because, as I stated above, the supplemental picked up a couple of provisions. Both the House and Senate are moving forward with their bills for FY19. Senate is due to mark up next week. I don't necessarily see more supplementals being likely, since a lot of supplemental need is driven by the need for funds in the disaster relief fund, but the last supplemental provided a significant amount of money to that, meant to try to get us through the rest of the fiscal year. But we will likely have the continuing resolution conversation again, despite how late Congress likes to push the deadline for the fiscal year. They always seem to need just a little bit more. And in general, appropriators don't like having to carry authorizing legislation in their bills, but having both a House and Senate version of the DRA could be a blessing and a curse for including anything like that on future appropriations. But at this point, with a conference occurring in September, I'd likely see they'll come to terms on some sort of agreement. It may pass with an appropriations bill, but it may not rely wholly on that. I want to make sure I hit on, even briefly here, some examples of what's going on at the state level. There are a lot of reorganizations occurring right now. The big one is in FEMA. They have moved a lot of functions. There's a big move towards resilience right now across the country. So FEMA recently moved continuity programs, mitigation, the flood insurance program, non-disaster grants, and preparedness into a resilience organization. This actually mirrors what a lot of states have already done across the country, and I suspect many other states will begin to follow suit. It's really all about integrating resilience and mitigation into the overall process here, and how to get the biggest bang out of Stafford projects by integrating mitigation into them. So by having everything organized together, it helps integrate that into the process. Iowa is actually doing something very innovative right now with their flood mitigation board. They started it in 2012. The board consists of 4 members of the public, 5 representatives from state agencies, and 4 from the General Assembly. It's chaired by the Homeland Security Emergency Management Division, and projects from across the state are submitted to the board for approval. They use a tax increment funded program, which is administered by the Emergency Management Department, to fund the projects. And right now, they are at about a little over $1.3 billion in available funds for that. So communities can spend the money as they receive it from the board, or they can leverage the tax increment funds as a commitment to a bond and then utilize the funding to pay back the bond. And North Carolina is doing a lot of work. They're really on the cutting edge right now with the work they're doing with LIDAR mapping. This aids them in situational awareness, evacuation planning, promoting flood insurance. They can get down to nearly the household level in terms of their data at this point. They used drones to do all of the mapping and spent about $21 million putting together the full system. And that came from various state agencies. Probably one of the biggest challenges for states right now is mitigating in the face of an aging infrastructure. I'm sure this is something that the representative has dealt with in Florida, but when you look across the country right now, estimates are about $21 billion to retrofit existing dams. You've got 1 out of 9 bridges that are not structurally sound, and that coupled with the need to make them more resilient to the impacts of a disaster, make it a very complicated process to be able to help move that forward. But hopefully, as we start looking more at the resilience landscape and how these things all tie together, states and federal government will be able to work to make that a reality. So I appreciate the opportunity to be on today, and hope that gives a little bit of context into the landscape.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt, and all our speakers. Now we will move into question and answer for probably about 10 minutes or so. We do have a few questions that have already come in, but don't forget, if you have a question, just please type it in the box on the left. As a reminder, the webinar is being recorded, so we will be, and it will be made available to participants. One question just to get us sort of started here. You know, obviously there are many angles from which to develop solutions to threats posed by natural disasters. What are some of the major ways, and we've talked about this sort of sporadically throughout, but what are some of the leading ways that legislation, either on the federal level or the state level, can be a vehicle for those solutions? And in what ways might solutions need to originate outside the legislative process, whether with volunteer work, like Representative Rothschein mentioned, with the private sector nonprofits? So where is legislation really, the answer there, and where is it not as much? And how about we take answers in the reverse order? So Matt, do you want to jump in?
Sure. One of the things that we've often stressed is that, especially when it comes to the Stafford Act, is that flexibility is key. People will look at the Stafford Act and say, well, it's very vague. Well, it's the way the Stafford Act was meant to be written. Much of what we legislate these days here in town with regard to the Stafford Act can already be done. But I think the key is maintaining the flexibility for the states to be able to operate within the federal system. And I couldn't specifically speak to the state legislation that would be necessary to help facilitate these kinds of efforts, but things like the Iowa board that I talked about and facilitating reorganizations at the state level to enhance resilience, those kinds of things probably help in terms of setting the stage more than some of the prescriptive changes that we may get at the national level here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, Representative Rothschein, did you want to jump in and tell us a little bit about maybe some of the bills that passed following the 2017 hurricane season that touched on some of those solutions?
Sure. And again, I just want to point out the select committee that the speaker formed under actually our Speaker Pro Tem, Annette Nunez out of Miami, chaired that committee, and we took recommendations from all silos. From shelters, and I think I mentioned that in my remarks. But one such recommendation that I think is going to be incredible is the provision that we added in there to protect residents in terms of investing in flood mitigation and land acquisition, and tying those issues together and just kind of encouraging those kind of guidelines for projects and rebuilding and other activities that kind of surround those functions. And we utilized the Florida Communities Trust to kind of serve as the facilitator of that. Again, and just trying to work smarter, not harder, and truly building a better and a stronger and more resilient Florida. And so mitigating for disaster kind of goes hand in hand with building resiliently, and that's kind of our theme down here right now. Obviously, we're a coastal state, so it's really hard to say, well, maybe you shouldn't build that home right there on that tip of that beach because of this and that. And so just, again, learning and incentivizing and encouraging, not necessarily mandating these stronger codes, because, again, we were like the poster child for old code versus new code. You would go up and down the streets, especially in the Middle Keys, and just see, newer houses were fine. Maybe they lost a screen or something like that, and then the older homes are just, devastated.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And Mr. Grimm, did you have thoughts from FEMA's perspective? I mean, maybe there are solutions that need to come from the agency or don't need to come from the agency.
Yeah, absolutely. There's, I'll mention something that happened this year in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, where it gave FEMA authority to implement HMGP, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, for fire mitigation assistance grant mitigation declarations. So when a fire, an FMAG, a fire fire gets declared at FEMA. We didn't previously have authorities to turn on the mitigation funding stream like we do for a presidentially declared disaster. So the Act gave us this authority, and it's really, so we ran a pilot in 2015 because we had a authority just for that 1 year. Now we have it for 17 and 18. Hopefully we may get it permanent someday. What we're able to do is turn on a funding stream for a community in these smaller fires to go out and do wildfire mitigation, or just as important, the post-wildfire flood and erosion type projects. When that watershed gets burned and there's a big erosion and flood hazard for the downstream areas, it turns on those funds now. And that required legislation, and we now have, I think, already about 90-ish, somewhere in that ballpark, FMAG declarations. So we're working to work with states now to roll that out and get that mitigation hitting the street quick. And then in terms of stuff that may or may not need legislation, there's a lot of different types of mitigation projects. So, as Matt said, the Stafford Act is pretty broad, and we have a list of our typical eligible activities, right, like acquisition, demolition, relocation, wind retrofit, wildfire, earthquake, whatever. But a lot of times communities will come in with a new hazard type that just we haven't dealt with before. A couple of years ago, Pennsylvania was out, in Florida actually too, we're having some issues with sinkholes and wanted to see about perhaps doing some buyouts with sinkholes. So we were able to, we didn't need legislation to do that. It was more technical policy type stuff, benefit costs, that sort of thing. So we have flexibilities where we can do some creative stuff within the Jersey barriers of the Stafford Act. So there's some certainly flexibility, and there's plenty of communities and states doing mitigation and not using FEMA money, and that's really important to capture.
All right, yeah, thanks all for your feedback in that area. I think we've got to wrap up. We'll have one more question, which we received here from John, just about the pre-disaster mitigation grants. Mike, would you be able to explain to legislators or others that might be on the line and looking to sort of apply for and receive those funds, what kind of steps they might take if they were interested?
You bet. And what I'll do is I will send you a short flyer that you can distribute if you want about our grant programs. It talks all about that. But the bottom line, just real quick, because I know we have a minute or so, eligible applicants for the grants, whether it's HMGP or PDM or the FMA programs, are generally states or tribes, and territories, and then the sub-applicants are usually the local governments, for example. So you get the state agencies, federally recognized tribes, local governments, and under HMGP we can also do private nonprofit. The state determines the priorities for mitigation, works with the locals to develop an application, submits that application to FEMA. There's certain eligibility criteria like benefit cost, etc. And then we go through a process to review those and make those awards and selections. We, in fact, are getting ready to roll out sometime later summer the application period for the 2018 PDM and FMA grants, and that will be published in the Federal Register through what's called a Notice of Funding Opportunity, and all the kind of rules of the road on the things we're looking for will be published because they are competitive grants. Some states also get a set aside, but it's much smaller, so the competitive pot is what they're going after as well. And be glad to share that so everybody can watch for that.
Hey, thanks. Thanks to everyone. I think we've got to wrap up here. That's really wonderful information. I'll be sure to make that available to listeners after the fact. I'd like to send a final thank you to our speakers. This webinar wouldn't be possible without you. And of course, thanks to all of our attendees for participating in today's webinar. And as a reminder, a recording of the webinar and presentation slides will be made available. Our next and final webinar will be held on June 28th, entitled Federal Infrastructure Funding for States an update while we wait. You can register for that webinar on the same page at ncsl.org you registered for this one. Thank you again for your continued interest and support for NCSL, and thanks again to our speakers, and have a great day.
Thank you.